Good afternoon. Hope you're well. Hope you're joining. Hope you can hear me. All the usual hopes. I did a show on Monday, my first back after a week off. I think that's the first full week I've managed to have off chewing it over, although we had a little bit of a break at Christmas time. But really enjoyed being back and talking with you, especially because we didn't have a guest on. And it got me to thinking that often these things are like, well, what should we talk about today? And I'm trying to feel the pulse of what's hot in our industry. And having had a week off, I was a bit rusty. And so it was kind of like, right, let's just talk about what's been on my mind. And you guys seem to respond fairly well to that. So I did the same and applied the same theme today and realized that I wanted to do something clinical. So I was like, right, what body part we're going to talk about, what condition? And I realized one of the things that's been very much on my mind clinically is that we ended up doing a podcast with Tonya Vincent, who's a professor studying clinical and she's a research rheumatologist and academic rheumatologist, and she was talking about OA and the latest and greatest in that, and she was on the last Physio Matters podcast, and it ended up being quite controversial because of what she came and said. Now she'd been on a podcast, a different podcast, and we'd spotted that via Jack March, who's obviously the rheumatology physio and my partner in crime when it comes to this stuff, and so he'd noticed that and said, look, it's game-changing stuff. Some of this research really throws off some of the heuristics of which we've been relying on in the contemporary practice, or what we thought was contemporary practice. And so we then got around to Physio Matters. Now, some of that got tidied up, but not all of it. You know, it still begged a lot of questions, and so the audience noticed that too. Jim did a brilliant interview with her and brought a lot of that stuff to the fore. So I was going to talk about that and just talk about my own musings in that direction. And I know many of you have been feeling a bit confused and conflicted and frustrated and want to challenge some of it and want to challenge us on it. And that's what this is all about and what it's for. If you haven't listened to Physio Matters, the last Physio Matters podcast yet, then I disown you. I disavow that behavior, and I can't stand for it, and it won't be abided around here. So unfortunately, no, you need to vacate this live stream, go and listen to it and repent, and you will regret it. So no excuses. But if you have, then you'll know exactly what I'm on about. It's a bloody confusing one. Now, I then, about 3 minutes ago, I then sent a text with the titles of what I'd planned for this, and sent it to Jim, who's literally just been teaching one of his rheumatology courses, with a fishing bait emoji saying, I'm talking about this, and sent him the guest link. And even though he's a busy man and has other things to do, but if ever there was a topic for him to join me on at a moment's notice, it's this one. And so he's like, fine, I'll join. Jim, bit of a fraught one, this, isn't it? Like, how are you feeling about the whole OA knee situation? How much did it rock your world, and have you managed to find your feet again?
Yeah, I think as I've thought about it over the last few weeks, because obviously I did the interview a few weeks before it then aired, so I've had a bit more time than everybody else to sort of digest it as well. And I think, you know, a lot of it is really fascinating. You have to take it with the caveat of that a lot of the research that was talked about in the podcast was in mice studies rather than human studies, human joints. So there are some differences there. So we do need to take that. And a lot of what Professor Vincent was talking about, we can't really do a lot about clinically because we can't measure it. So I think it's something we need to keep on top of. We need to understand the research that's coming out. But actually, does it change what we're doing at the moment? No, I don't think it does, because, you know, if we take she was talking about the shear forces, for example, which, you know, before me and you have talked about it, we might call them micro movements or however we might term them. We can't measure them. So how do we know that our interventions are impacting on them? If someone has those shear forces, how do we know someone has inappropriate shear forces? And we know that we're given all of the other research we've ever seen in humans, there's going to be a variation on what can be. So one human will tolerate a huge amount of shear forces and never get OA, and another human will tolerate a small amount. So what's the variation? And there's so many unanswered questions about them. I just think we just need to know that it exists, the research, and keep on top of it until such time we can start using it clinically.
What do you think, what does it leave in play and what does it blow wide open? So I want to just give a couple of examples that I'm still wrestling with. Like, it had been contentious to say wear and tear because it was then seen as being, well, no, it's just that the mechanical load forces are somewhat irrelevant, wholly irrelevant, or less relevant, or not relevant enough to use that sort of terminology. Is that something that's still in play? Is it still known to be more genetic and bad luck than it is sort of use? What sort of stands for what we thought even a few months ago? Between me and you, I don't mean the royal we. I mean what we thought was contemporary practice and what we would, I think back, admittedly for me, a few months back, I wouldn't have vilified, but I'd certainly think that someone was behind the times if they were suggesting that essentially just the torsional forces at the knee were the thing that was rubbing the cartilage down over time. The more you've done that over the course of your life, that's the narrow cause of OA. Now, I still, from what I gather, I don't think that's all the way back in, but it's certainly it's begging that question again. Where are we at?
Yeah, I think this is one of those cases where it's accidentally correct. So someone's gone, if they're saying wear and tear, they're adding 2 and 2 and making 9, and 9 is actually the correct answer. But the reasoning process for getting there is incorrect. So my understanding from that podcast was, so if we take it, we really simplify down what we mean by wear and tear, which would be literally your knee is like a car tire, and the more you use it, the more that cartilage rubs away, as would happen with a car tire. And even you could extend that analogy that if you did loads of sideways sliding on a car tire, like a shear force, it would rub away more quickly. Then the outcome is the same as what we're talking about, where you get cartilage thinning and poorer cartilage quality. But I don't think that's the mechanism at play. So trying to understand what Professor Vincent was saying is that these different types of forces generate different reactions within the cartilage. So as if you would have a positive influence through loading and a negative influence through loading, with the way that these gene triggers are turned on and off, and what that means for chondrocyte activity, etc. So these right. Shear forces aren't triggering the chondrocytes to behave appropriately, whereas for want of a better term, more direct loading would trigger them. So rather than it being, and I tried to get across what I was thinking about this as on the fly, and I bet that came across was my brain going at 10,000 miles an hour during the podcast, was rather than thinking it like an active wearing away, it's more of a lack of restoration. So a bit like we would think about sort of I would term it like osteoporosis. In osteoporosis, you don't have an active, usually outside of some other thing, you don't have an active bone loss. You have a loss of restoration of bone turnover. So you turn over this much bone, you replace it with this much, and therefore you end up with less bone mass. And I think that's a better way of thinking about it rather than an active use and reduction. So, but then that does leave some unanswered questions to me, as in, so is it purely, how is it, if you're doing the appropriate loading but then the shear, what's that doing? And how is that?
But it could be something. It could be something in between, couldn't it? Like what the predominant. It's not going to be a binary. But we to see if you're all right with this analogy, not on a mechanistic level with regards to chondrocytes. I don't think this would apply anywhere near the same degree. But we are kind of comfortable with the logic that occurs within tendons. Like if you were to just have if you just to do lots of sprinting, lots of plyometric work and going really fast, particularly what we've come to know and what Seth O'Neill speaks well on is this notion of which if your musculature isn't strong enough to be obviously supportive and shielding of the tendon, therefore you'll get this locking on cramping style effect on a micro level of say a calf musculature, and then the tendon has to do all that work, especially if the muscle's not tolerating it. That's a mechanical force going through the tendon that can be deleterious to both its structure and function, and it's therefore plus or minus symptoms. But then equally slow heavy loading, we've kind of come to know the mechanism of response there is contentious. But we accept that both are loads, and one can be detrimental, one can be hopefully helpful. Are we in? Does that analogy carry to where your head's at with OA?
I think it does, and it also gives, when we talk about the other things that would lead to joint instability and as a proxy therefore more instability, like ACL ruptures, we know there's a huge burden of osteoarthritis once you have an ACL rupture, meniscal tears, those kinds of things. I think that carries as well. And then you've got added on top of that, we've got then the systemic factors, and this is where I think I was going wrong. I was going too far down the rabbit hole of systemic factors and going, it's all systemic. And the factors are all whether you're overweight, smoke, eat poorly, and far less around any mechanical loading, because we know that there are people with radiographic osteoarthritis with no symptoms. And I don't think I got a satisfactory answer in the end from out of Professor Vincent. And I don't know if it's not her area of expertise, in all fairness, to go asking down that route. And I think because of that, I went too far and I started to ignore some of the potential mechanistic effects, because as we found out, it's damn complicated. And a lot of the things that she mentioned are things that have not come onto my radar from a biological effect. I didn't know a lot of those things occurred or even existed at the time, which is why my brain was going. So I think that brings in the mechanical effects, but like I say, what do we do with that information? I don't know at the moment, and it's difficult. Yeah.
Do you think it's because there's a few reasons I can think of as to why you and many of us would have moved more down that systemic effect, but particularly for you, as said rheumatology physio, you can understand why. I mean, I thought that a couple of years ago you would have been someone I expected to go down this route of OA just being an extension of RA, like this narrative that emerged. It was sort of a low grade version of it, and if we studied it far enough, you'd find blood-based markers. You'd also recognize that DMARDs and other corrective medicines could do that. You were never convinced of that, and obviously then you've been sort of justified in that hesitancy because the studies have never borne good fruit there. But also it makes sense for you to see it as being more systemic, in part because we know about adipokines. You've written extensively on that. We know about the fact that, and this is what's contentious for me, is she was saying she didn't seem to give much credence to that and suggested that someone's paralyzed, they don't get ONE. It needs some load. Is that because she's just meaning that can be, it's necessary, not sufficient? But how does she account for OA thumb in otherwise idle people, OA shoulder that we know occurs in obese smokers more than it does in otherwise well people, even builders that are using their shoulders more? That for me seemed like there's still so many questions around that, where I think maybe for various reasons she's so into the mechanistic literature, even though her background is as a rheumatologist. That for me feels like another podcast either by us or others.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a couple of components to that. So the systemic effects, let's go there first. So from my understanding, what she's saying is that they will further down regulate that restoration of the cartilage. So the adipokines and the increased systemic inflammation will reduce your body's ability to restore the cartilage. So you'll get a more of that disparity between turnover, if that makes sense. I think I'm making sense. The non-weight bearing joints is the way I'm currently justifying that, in that there's not the high load. It actually, what she was saying, fits to me better than purely to do with systemic effects. Because if you think about the joints you just mentioned, the shoulder and the thumb, and I will admit to not knowing very CMC biomechanics very well, but to me they are inherently more unstable joints. So you would, with a shoulder, compare a shoulder range of motion compared to a knee. There's vast difference between the ranges of motion and the style of motion of that joint. And I think that actually what you're therefore getting is through the shoulder and your thumb, you're not getting compressive load as much, you're getting more shear. So now I don't want anybody to take this away as fact, please. This is literally how my brain is going at the moment. And then if you then think about a lot of the, I think about a lot of the things that Adam Meekins and Joe Gibson would treat the shoulder with, and it's weight bearing load, and you're getting compression into the joint. And then I talked about to Deb Stanton, and it's all with the thumb. It's about appropriate exercise and load. And you can, if you do grip in the wrong way, you can aggravate the joint, probably because of the way you're compressing or lack of compress of the joint. And I wonder whether those are actually factors that are leading to those. That's the load we're talking about in those joints. And if you imagine if I was to grip, the way that my thumb moves is sort of more lateral than it is in the knee, you'd get more of a rotation. I wonder what impact that has. But again, that's literally me thinking, just following my train of thought. I haven't seen any research to do that, to say.
Yeah, this is sort of an early hypothesis from you. I mean, it is as if we're just chewing it over, Jim, isn't it? As if we didn't plan this in any meaningful way, and 3 minutes before we went live I sent you a link to try and bait you in. Now what that does mean is that I was planning on soloing this episode, and therefore you've been able to give far more thoughtful analysis on this than I would. But it also means that I made a little list of a few talking points of which we're going to cue me to just reflect on and ask the question. So here you are, and I can't help but ask you, but I'll also happily riff on it myself. Before I do, though, I want to just say that we've come on here today, and there's been clearly a software update on the software that we use for this show, and now I can't click these comments that you normally put them up on screen. I need to work out how to use this thing again. So apologies to Rob Sire, Katie Napton, James Armstrong, and others that have posted some lovely comments that I would normally flash up on screen, but I can't seem to do that. Now, this chat overlay thing works. However, that weirdly doesn't seem to then bring on their comments. So look, I'm sorry. Usually this is more interactive. I can read them, but I can't share them.
I've come on here wearing a shirt, and you can't even get comments on the screen.
You've got a shirt and I've got a hoodie on. It really is that I feel so underdressed. But his immaculate hair always puts me to shame. James had said, really interesting to hear Jack March's thoughts. Jack March reflecting and voicing his thoughts on potentially changing his thinking. That's not something we've ever been averse to, but I suppose it is quite rare, isn't it? Especially something as confrontational to our thoughts as that is something that's fairly rare. It was fairly abrupt, wasn't it? I mean, we had a conversation. I don't think we cried, did we? But we could well have done. It was quite startling. But on that theme, I wanted to sort of ask, and also I'll happily share first, is for me what this does is it really does change things in terms of policy, or should change things in terms of policy, especially because we were always a bit cautious, I'd say, on this. I know that sounds like just a bit of a cop-out, but the idea that we kind of knew enough about OA, what it is, what it isn't, in order to therefore mandate certain service structures, or to say that this should be triage if they're not ready for surgery or interventional care, then this is something that they need to go into an escape pain style program that therefore doesn't need to be especially individualized, barring a few variables. There is a cookie cutter approach, if ever there was one, on pathology. OA is OA and OA knee is OA knee, and therefore this amount of sessions and the sort of dosage was something that was then pitched to the mean. And unlike patient-centeredness across other more diverse conditions, this is something that there are enough people, enough similarities for it to probably work like that. And so this is what we do with regards to diagnosis. This is what we do with regards to messaging. This is what we do with regards to imaging. This is how many sessions your service needs to be developed for. This is the type of group. You need to train them the therapist in this particular way. This is the banding of which should deliver it. And this is the package of care cost price for, say, an NHS service or a private provider to deliver something like escape pain. That research I've always challenged as being something that was never pitched against a decent localized control group, which is difficult. So the pragmatic trials weren't necessarily against best practice and standard care versus that, and I think maybe inflated those results. But above all else, on a policy level, I like to think that this work that's been done and this podcast that you put out there at least gives us enough clue that this is still such a moving picture, that anything dogmatic like that, or anything that's too rigid that then sets the scene for that, we could end up regressing by years and needing a revamp and a reform from that, right? If we don't give services enough freedom to manage things as we're describing and to consider these variables, and we go down this, it's purely systemic. If we can just get people moving, and that we don't need to concentrate on focal loading, we're probably going to miss opportunities for somewhat interventional measures. I mean, I imagine it probably brings in other biomechanical interventions, but like altering someone's focal loading by way of, say, orthoses or stick use or bracing, or, you know, obviously a procedure was even mentioned, wasn't it, with regards to distraction. And imagine that there was, say, a brace that came out that was able to apply some degree of distraction, even modest compared to the surgical one. But that is a game changer. And if we end up creating services that have to comply within a narrow scope of the mean, then that's going to really set us back, isn't it? And maybe people perceive that we've been championing a cookie cutter approach, which I don't think is fair. But that was something I wanted to I was going to be riffing on. I just wonder what your thoughts are on the implications on policy.
I think that as we stand at the minute, even with that podcast, the ignoring the dogmatism, the class-based approach for something like OA&E probably at the moment is the right way to go, as long as the flexibility is in the system, that as soon as the research that we've talked about bears fruit that we can assess for and appropriately treat, those can be adjusted, right? And I suspect that what you'll get is you'll have subsets of patients with osteoarthritis. This is what I think will happen. When you can measure shear force, you'll have some patients with osteoarthritis with a tiny amount of shear, and they respond to a generalized exercise program because actually their problem is systemic, right? Then you'll have patients who have a huge amount of shear, and they will respond to biomechanical changing like bracing or specific, you know, quadricep strengthening, let's say, so they stabilize the knee, or it might even be proprioceptive. And I think, and then they'll get a mix in the middle, right, of which will make the bell curve. There's no point putting those people that need that interventional medicine into a generalized exercise program. So as long as there's the flexibility within the system to allow for those new emergent groups, then we'll be okay. We're a while away from that. And I suspect most people will need a combination of those things. And like you say, I don't think that even if we could measure shear forces and see the subgroups within them, I don't think bracing is at a point where it could control them sufficiently. As you said, the intervention that Professor Vincent mentioned, I think that there is work. It seems to have shown this restoration of cartilage being quite significant, but I think there's work to be done to say, is that worth going through the procedure, which was 6 weeks, or I think of this fixed, it's an X fix essentially. So your knee can't flex, can't bend, so you're going to get muscle wasting. If you can't drive, these patients are going to be younger end of the spectrum, so they won't be able to drive. A lot of them won't be able to go to work, do their functional tasks, all these sorts of things. Or is that offset? Is that going to be for what you gain out of that? Is that going to be worth it? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And I don't.
I hope they've been doing the repeat studies in lockdown, because the social consequences will be far smaller now. And so it would be really interesting to have that, because it's a kind of, but then similarly that would cook the books in that direction, wouldn't it? Whereby the deleterious effects are mitigated because of the social consequence we found ourselves in because of the pandemic. Therefore, that's not a fair test compared to in a couple of years' time or beyond that. And
we'd certainly need really long outcomes. Like, you know, if you were comparing the number of people that ended up with a knee replacement for, let's say, that distraction therapy, X-Fix versus physiotherapy, you can imagine the number of people you would need in that study. And it's going to have to be 10, 15, 20 years as well, duration. So I think we're a long way off that sort of thing.
It tickles me a little bit, though, because right in this moment, I think you're being the pragmatist and I'm being the guy that's obsessing over the mechanism of effect, which is usually a role reversal thing for us, isn't it? Like, you just stickler for mechanism of effect. I love that stuff, but I'm also sort of like, what's that look like on the ground? So let me just try and play devil's advocate on some of the stuff you've said with regards to the groups and stuff. Is that I think one of the big this is that the mechanism of effect of those interventions is the fact that it's a good bang for your buck with regards to getting some strengthening, getting some social interaction, getting them moving, getting them building confidence, the psychosocial intervention of camaraderie that can occur there, as well as the fact that it starts to qualify them for exercise and starts to address some of the systemic factors that we've talked about, and potentially even give some behavioral interventions on smoking and obesity, etc. Right? Fine. However, the psychological qualification for that engagement is often this perception that it ain't for surgery, and that would be quite significant. Often, I think one of the motivating features that occurs in departments there is a bit of scaremongering over major joint surgery, and like the people get carried away and infer that it kind of scares people away from knee replacements sometimes when they're even indicated. That's one of the things I found in advanced practice. It's kind of like, I get why you want to try and motivate someone who's got mild OA knee to not do that first line. Like, if they've got a few weeks worth of symptoms and they think they're in for a knee replacement, that wouldn't be appropriate. And well, I'm willing to pay for it and stuff like that, where they're sort of forcing the hand and being a bit too rash. But there's often sort of a moderate OA which is kind of on the fence for a knee replacement. He's willing to give something a go, but he's then scared to death about something that's a really powerful and useful intervention in a knee replacement and got good outcomes. But what I'm getting at with this is that there is a sweet spot whereby someone's motivation for participation within a group thing like that is something that they're into an awful lot of options. And I think that therefore what you were saying about groups is something that kind of gets a bit disqualified by the fact that it does seem that there is more nuance to it. There's more individualized variation that could be occurring, not because we can suddenly measure shear forces, but we've got proxies for that, haven't we? If someone's got a history of major ligament disruption or meniscal tearing that may well, and we can even sometimes visibly see or to some degree measure, if you fancy enough to have some sort of force plate or dynamic gait analysis or something that could potentially, you could conceive of, well, they're going to get more shear force and torsion because look at the literal tibial. Let's say someone's had a complex ORIF or something in the past, right? And we can sort of conceive of the fact that they're getting shear forces for that. The fact that we used to lump them into groups was this utilitarian approach to it, which was justified by pooling them because we only use these blunt tools. Whereas actually, if the more of the sharp tools, the more individualized tools come forward, then those group interventions shouldn't be as justified. And I suppose that's why I worry about that being baked into the system, but also something that justifies generic practice rather than person-centered care for a group of people that are overlumped into category. I don't know if there's anything you disagree with there.
No, I do agree. And I think there's probably an argument to be made around the age of the patient that you're putting into those groups as well, and why have they developed osteoarthritis at an early age versus a later age. And once you get to 70, 75, 80, you can probably be more generic than you can with someone who's 40 or 45, because for the want of a better phrase, they don't need to live with that joint for as long. And actually, if you sent them to a group, and after 6 weeks it's not making any difference, and they go for a knee replacement, fine. But if you've got someone who's 40 or 45 and you send them for a generic group and it doesn't work after 6 weeks, and then you're sending them for a knee replacement, that's a really different kettle of fish. That someone's then got to live with a knee replacement 40, 45, 50 years. That's very different, and I think it's something that I certainly don't have an answer to, but it's certainly something we need to consider. And the variables you're discussing there are probably slightly more complicated versions of that as well. So those people who have had a ligament disruption and are young, what do they need to do? The people that haven't had that, but they've got a real genetic component, so their dad had OA at 40 and now they've got OA at 40. What's the difference there? What do we need to do with them? Smokers, non-smokers, BMI, high, et cetera, et cetera. And I think where the difficulty comes is that you will get a decent, whatever we define that as, benefit from from the cookie cutter approach, because it will address a number of factors which we know are involved. So then you get this problem we get with a lot of the research at the moment around various different things, is when we then go to specifics, how much better will the specifics be than the generic, because we can't target the specifics well enough. And I think we're all noticed that you can really get ahead of the cart ahead of the horse if you try and be specific with things, and then your research won't show it into a good benefit over generic, because you're not targeting specifics appropriately. So yeah,
well, we could get sucked into the whole stratification debate again. And that's not necessarily what I'm advocating for. I know some people make a great case for it, by the way, so I'm not dismissing it, but that's actually not where I end up. And I know it's not where you end up. Really on this typically it's the first time we've really got stuck into it on air at moment's notice, but I kind of feel like I feel that water probably more than you, because of my MSKR hat, is that I see the fact that there are some local policies that are actually it would be really hard to turn that ship around, right? If 1 to 2 triage style advanced practice assessments were then to triage people into group intervention, of which they need to see a course through, and that it's only their reaction to that intervention that qualifies them for surgery or not, or evaluation as to whether they failed care and stuff, right? It's too rigid. That's a cookie cut, not of a section of a cohort or a locality. That's what we do for OA, full stop, regardless of your age, etc., and all the variables we've talked about. And that's not something that could be like, oh well, we've learned from quality service evaluation that was a mistake, therefore we can walk it back quickly. It's like, well, no, that's probably inevitable. And because of passionate advocacy and the fact that that intervention is being funded directly for a period of time as being best practice, means that it's something that could then mean that the services and the system wouldn't be versatile enough. And that concerns me, certainly, as a taxpayer. Apologies for those of you that have participated in this. I have not been able to bring your comments up on screen and questions up on screen because the system's changed. And so I'll look into this and have it ready for tomorrow.
This is why you don't take a week off, because then the technology changes and now you're behind.
Can't keep up.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, that is hilarious that, on my week off, they've updated it and truly changed its functionality. Now, fortunately, though, I don't think this has changed. I think the ability for me to show pictures of the Active Force 2, which is available for just £300 at physio-matters.com/AF2. I think that function seems to remain. But we're over time now. Thanks so much, mate, at a moment's notice. And especially this needs to be something we continue to muse on. I know we need to produce some future material to help our hyperventilating audience to some extent on this, because I can understand why it threw a lot of them off, as it did us, and we're probably a few weeks ahead of them on thinking about this. So thanks for those of you that have contributed to the conversation so far. Let's keep it going, and certainly chewing it over on clinical topics like this is something that I want to make sure we do fairly regularly. So and probably at more than 3 minutes notice if I do want you involved, mate.
Yeah, that'd be ideal.
All right, take care.
All right,
so shield your ears, mate.